Now, why is it that both of these circuits, right, the pulmonary as well as the systemic circuit, move back the blood back through veins back into the heart? Well, the heart, of course, is our pump, right? The heart is, through its contractions, is squeezing the blood that is within it, obviously, and is pushing it forward, right, and is the impetus that is moving the blood throughout the entire body that allows for the bulk flow of this dissolved oxygen within our blood throughout all of our tissues, right? So it's extremely important that we have a pump like a heart, and in fact just about any organism that has blood also has some sort of artery that is at least enlarged with muscles around it, right, that can contract and act as a heart. So that's not a big surprise. We have it twice though, so we have basically a dual pump, if you want, right, because we're pumping independently the deoxygenated blood that just returned from the systemic circuit, as well as the oxygenated blood that just returned from the pulmonary circuit, and push it again and move it into the other circuit now, right? And the reason why we actually need two has something to do with the blood pressure in the various vessels. And so, as you might imagine, when we're coming straight, right, when the blood is coming straight out of the heart, we're obviously going to have very high blood pressure, right? We just decrease the volume here of the heart, so we're squeezing that blood, right, which is increasing the pressure, which is why it moves in the first place into the various arteries. And in fact, these arteries have to withstand quite a bit of pressure, and so if you look at them, the way that they're constructed, the wall of these big major arteries that are leaving the heart especially, and the few that, you know, the bigger ones that are there thereafter, with that great pressure that is put on them, are actually quite thick. They're very robust, or built in a very robust way. Well, you might imagine now that as we're moving through and we're moving into finer and finer arteries that we're splitting up until we're finally in these capillary beds, you might think, well, this might actually increase the blood pressure, right? Because you might think, well, it's sort of like if I take a hose that has a big diameter and then make that diameter smaller, it will increase the pressure, and actually the blood will even, or the fluid then shoots even faster through that very, very thin vessel. Maybe it's quite surprising, actually, but the opposite happens. As we're moving the blood away from these big arteries and into these finer blood vessels, and especially once we get to the capillaries, the blood pressure has dropped precipitously. Why is that? That's weird, right? And there's actually two different reasons for this. The first reason is we're splitting up these arteries into so many small arteries, right? These capillary beds contain so many, this enormous quantity of capillaries, that we're actually, the cross-sectional area of all of these capillaries combined, so if we add them all together into the cross-sectional area, right, if we could just add them into one big one, the cross-sectional area of all of these capillaries combined is greater, actually, than much greater than the cross-section of the aorta that or the pulmonary artery that we initially pushed the blood into, right? So actually, it's the opposite, right, where we're actually spreading this blood out into more and more, or into a bigger and bigger cumulative cross-sectional area, even though the individual arteries are getting smaller and smaller along the way. So, of course, it's the cumulative cross-sectional area that matters, right? So as we're increasing that, as we're going into these capillary beds, the blood pressure will obviously drop. That's reason number one. Reason number two, the interesting thing is actually we're losing blood fluid. Now, why is that? The reason is blood vessels are not these watertight, waterproof, whatever entities, like, for example, our drainage pipes or something like that are totally leak-proof, right, where water can neither go in nor out. Of course, blood vessels are not that way. They shouldn't even be that way because, of course, we have to be able to move both actually dissolved oxygen, but all sorts of other metabolic products and sugars and, you know, all these different kinds of molecules have to, and salts and various, right, ions, various kinds of molecules have to move in and out, of course, of the bloodstream into the tissue surrounding it. And so these blood vessels are anything but leak-proof. And so as we're increasing this pressure, we're actually squeezing out quite a bit of the water, or at least a portion of the water that is in the blood, out of the blood vessels, the blood cells, of course, right? The red blood cells don't fit through, so they stay behind, of course, and the white blood cells, right, stay behind in the arteries, right, in the blood, but the liquid itself, the water can be squeezed out of them into the tissue. And so we're actually even losing some of the blood volume in the both types of arteries, right, in both the pulmonary as well as the systemic circuit. Of course, we can't do that forever, right? We would actually, the water has to, of course, come back out of the tissue and back into the circulatory system. And interestingly, that does happen. That happens to some extent actually in the veins, in the major veins, as we're coming back from the capillary beds, right? Where we're now going into bigger and bigger and bigger veins in this case, right? Because we're moving towards the heart now, and since we're also picking up CO2 that forms actually carbonic acid, we're increasing the solute concentration, in a way the saltiness, if you want to think of it that way, right, in the blood. And so we're actually moving osmotically, right, through concentration gradients, through diffusion, that water back into the veins. However, not all of the water makes it all that far, and so we actually have a second system of tubes. I don't know if you know this or not. Some of you may, right? We have that lymphatic system. So it's another system of tubes, as it were, right, that is moving fluids. And these are, in fact, the places, the lymphatic system is where we're actually moving a lot of this interstitial water, is what we call that, or fluids, the fluids that are between the cells, right? And we're moving it back into that lymphatic system that actually connects to the circulatory system in this region, actually, sort of in this region up here, and dumps fluid back actually into the main veins that are coming back into the heart. Now, long story short, we diverted here a little bit, right? The big picture here is that we increase the pressure as we're contracting that heart, so the blood pressure increases tremendously. It is very high in the initial arteries that come out of it, right? And so these arteries have to be very thick and robust to withstand that pressure. By the time we're in the capillary beds, actually the blood pressure has decreased quite a bit. And once we're behind these capillary beds, actually the blood pressure does not really come up very much, maybe a little bit, right? But it actually stays relatively low. Why? Because we actually have reduced blood volume back in these veins, right? That have to move the water. So the blood pressure actually in veins is relatively low, and you can actually see that even reflected in the thickness of the vessel, right? Of the wall of the veins, which are much thinner, in fact, than the walls of arteries that have to withstand a lot more blood pressure, right, in order not to rupture. The other thing, of course, is that we have to somehow move that volume of blood back in those veins, even though our blood pressure in the veins is now very low. How do we do that? There is some pressure that allows it to move, but it's actually really hard to move that blood now against gravity. So it's especially right from the blood that we're trying to move into this inferior vena cava that has to return to the heart from the bottom of the body against gravity, right back up. And this is very hard to do, and it's actually, we don't have even sufficient blood pressure really to do that very effectively. And so to actually move that blood back, what is quite important actually are muscle movements. So if you sit for a very long time, you might want to move your legs a little bit, because it's the squeezing of actually the muscles around, right? They contract and tighten up and bulge, right? And so they actually help move, they squeeze the veins associated with it and actually help move that blood back up. And to prevent backflow, so that the blood in these veins where there's very little pressure, right, that would prevent it once you relax your muscle to just flow back out, we actually have quite a number of valves that are sitting in these major veins, like for example, that are coming out of the lower extremities all the way back up, that open only in one direction, right? And in fact, in this way, you can think of it as two, actually it's more than two, it's like three flaps, but as flaps that come together like this, right, where they can open if we squeeze from down below, right? If we squeeze fluid through, they can open and let it through. But when it comes back down and it wants to cut, right, and wants to empty back downward in the direction of gravity, right? Once we relax the muscles, they actually pull shut like a trap door, right? And they don't actually allow that blood to flow back down. And so we're just pushing it step by step, almost like helping it, right, move upward along those major veins and including in the vena cava until we finally can actually put that blood back into the heart to give it another push, right, and go back through the other circuit, right, back through the arteries associated with the other circuit.